I am Julian. I am 32 years old. Tonight, at what was supposed to be my younger brother Preston's grand celebration of his upper-class future, my own family had me banished to the service entrance like a piece of unwanted garbage. As I stood by the loading dock in my faded denim jacket and an old gray sweatshirt, the security guard Brutus looked at my casual clothes, sneered, pointed a heavy finger toward the dumpsters and said, "Staff goes that way, buddy. Don't block the real guests." My own mother, Margaret, saw it happen from the passenger seat of her leased luxury car. She simply rolled the window up without a single word and laughed with the bride's family as the valet opened her door. They thought I was an absolute nobody, an embarrassment to their sudden ascent into high society. But there was one massive secret they didn't know. I didn't just happen to find a job here. I owned this entire multimillion-dollar luxury resort, the land it sat on, and every single contract their fragile new lifestyle depended on. And right now, as the truth begins to unravel in front of everyone they ever wanted to impress, they are begging me to save them from total financial ruin and public humiliation. Before I tell you exactly how I turned their night of triumph into a brutal lesson they will never forget, please hit that like button if you believe in justice. And don't forget to let me know in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Now, let us go back to the very beginning, where the cracks in our family foundation first started to show. Growing up in our suburban household, appearances were the only currency that carried any real value. My parents, Richard and Margaret, treated our lives like a continuous, exhausting corporate marketing campaign. We lived in a neighborhood governed by an extremely strict homeowners association, and my mother treated those HOA meetings like she was running for federal office. If a neighbor bought a new premium sedan, Richard had to upgrade his lease the following Monday, even if it meant skipping mortgage payments. If a coworker mentioned a timeshare in Florida or a ski trip to Aspen, Margaret would spend weeks rearranging our family budget just to secure a better reservation, completely ignoring the mounting credit card debt. They were people who lived under the constant, suffocating terror of what other people might think of them. But their greatest investment, the project they poured all their pride, attention, and high expectations into, was my younger brother, Preston. Preston was the classic golden child. He was born with the kind of effortless charm and symmetrical good looks that allowed him to slide through life without ever experiencing the weight of a consequence. When he smashed the neighbor's expensive greenhouse window with a baseball at age 10, Richard actually threatened the neighbor with a lawsuit for putting the glass structure too close to our property line. When Preston failed his high school algebra midterms, Margaret spent days haranguing the school board, demanding they allow him a private retake because a failing grade would ruin his chances at a premium college fund. He was their golden ticket to the social validation they desperately craved. I, on the other hand, was simply the older brother who was expected to provide the quiet, steady background noise. I was the one they quietly prayed would just find a decent salary someday. A gentle way of saying they considered me a complete lost cause. I was the invisible pillar holding up their grand illusions. When my grandfather passed away, they treated his funeral like a networking event, handing out business cards while standing next to the casket. Worse, they took my portion of the inheritance, money that was explicitly meant for my college fund, and used it to settle a quiet legal dispute when Preston totaled his first car in a reckless driving incident. I never saw a dime of that money, and when I asked about it, Margaret told me that family sacrifices for family. But the sacrifice only ever seemed to go one way. I remember one specific Thanksgiving dinner when I was 24. I had just spent 14 hours straight working on an independent real estate software consulting contract, barely scraping together enough sleep to drive across the state line to be at the family table. I sat down, exhausted, my hands still rough from the physical toll of endless typing, moving boxes, and relentless stress. Margaret took one look at my tired eyes and my plain flannel shirt, leaned over, and adjusted my collar with a sharp, impatient jerk. She told me I looked like a vagrant drifter who had wandered in from the Walmart parking lot. Then, she turned her entire attention to Preston, proudly announcing to the extended family that Richard had just secured a massive loan against his 401k to pay for Preston's Ivy League fraternity dues and his summer internship housing. They didn't even ask how my small business was doing. They didn't ask if I had eaten that day. They didn't care. To them, My life was an unsteady, vague online project that they couldn't proudly explain to their friends at the country club. I watched Preston soak up the compliments, swirling his wine glass with the practiced arrogance of a man who believed the world owed him a luxury living by birthright. He looked across the table at me, flashed that lazy smile, and told me that maybe if I worked harder at a real corporate job and chased a real promotion, I could eventually afford to buy a suit that didn't look like it came from a clearance rack. Richard laughed loudly, raising his glass to toast his youngest son's bright, polished future. That was the exact moment the final thread of my familial obligation snapped. I realized that you cannot force people to see you when they are entirely blinded by their own superficial illusions. 3 years ago, I packed everything I owned into the back of an old truck and left town without a formal goodbye. I didn't ask for their help, and I certainly didn't receive any. They never questioned where I went. They never called to check if I was making rent or if I had enough food on the table. In their minds, I had simply faded into the background of a different city, a minor disappointment they could easily gloss over during their weekend cocktail hours. They had no idea that while they were busy maintaining the facade of wealth on borrowed credit, I was working 18-hour days building a specialized commercial real estate and property management firm from absolutely nothing. I spent those 3 years learning the intricate, brutal language of corporate leverage. I bought distressed properties, restructured failing corporate leases, handled massive commercial lawsuit settlements, and quietly acquired independent luxury hospitality brands across the region. I didn't do it for revenge. I did it because absolute financial independence was the only shield I had against their conditional affection. By the time my company, Lane Holdings, finalized the acquisition of the premier coastal resort where Preston's engagement party was currently being held, I was the sole majority shareholder of a hospitality network spanning 3 states. I kept my name entirely off the public guest-facing marketing materials. I preferred the silence of the executive suite to the noise of public applause. My wealth was quiet, legally bulletproof, and utterly massive. Then, 2 weeks ago, my phone rang. It was Margaret. Her voice didn't carry the warmth of a mother checking on her long-lost son. It had the sharp, clipped tone of an executive coordinator running through a checklist. She spoke quickly, like she was afraid I might interrupt her script. She didn't ask about my health, my career, or my life. She simply informed me that Preston had managed to propose to Victoria, the daughter of Winston and Beatrice. She described this family as true old money, the type of people who owned multiple summer homes, commanded massive trust funds, and spoke fluently about heritage and legacy. She told me the engagement party would be an exceptionally elegant, important affair, full of influential people who understood the true meaning of high-level success. Then came the familiar, heavy blow. She said that just this once, I needed to make an actual effort to dress appropriately. She told me to buy a decent jacket, trim my hair, and try to look like I belonged to the family instead of someone who accidentally wandered into their professional portraits. She genuinely believed she was helping me avoid public embarrassment. I told her I would be there. I didn't mention my company. I didn't mention my real estate portfolio. I just let the silence hang, knowing that the shiny world they were so desperate to enter was about to collide with a reality they were entirely unprepared to handle. When I arrived at the resort gates tonight, the air was crisp, carrying the heavy scent of the ocean and expensive perfume. Sleek luxury vehicles were sliding up the grand driveway, dropping off guests wrapped in tailored silk and diamonds. I parked my regular truck at the far end of the public lot, walked toward the main entrance wearing my everyday jeans and an old sweatshirt, wanting to see exactly how deep the illusion ran. The security guard, Brutus, didn't hesitate for a single fraction of a second. He stepped directly into my path, his hand resting firmly on his heavy utility belt, his eyes scanning my plain clothes with instant dismissal. He pointed his thumb toward the concrete path leading down around the kitchen docks and told me the staff entrance was in the back. I looked at him, then looked past his shoulder to where my mother's car was idling at the valet station. Margaret looked out the window, caught my eye, and immediately rolled the glass up, turning her head away to laugh at a joke Winston was making. She chose the illusion over her own son. I didn't argue with Brutus. I didn't demand to see the manager. I simply turned around and walked down the dark concrete ramp, letting the familiar chill of their rejection settle over me. I thought that was the worst behavior I would witness tonight. I was so incredibly wrong. Walking through the massive resort kitchen felt like entering a different ecosystem altogether. The air was thick with the scent of roasted garlic, searing meats, and the palpable high-voltage stress of a high-end catering operation. Chefs were shouting orders in rapid-fire French and English, line cooks were flipping heavy iron pans, and servers were adjusting their uniform vests in front of polished stainless steel counters. I moved quietly, blending into the shadows near the prep stations. Because I had spent the last 3 years analyzing corporate efficiency and hospitality logistics, I could spot the signs of systemic strain instantly. The staff wasn't just working hard. They were visibly frantic, their movements dictated by chaotic, last-minute demands rolling in from the ballroom floor. A young floor manager rushed past me, his face pale and slick with sweat, holding a clipboard like a shield as he muttered about another ridiculous change to the timeline. I stepped back, letting him through, and slipped into a quiet alcove where the extra uniform jackets were kept on a rolling rack. A quiet, older housekeeping worker named Nadia noticed me standing there. Assuming I was a new temporary worker who had arrived late for the massive banquet shift, she pulled a black serving vest and a folded linen apron from the rack and handed them to me. She told me to hurry up because the family upstairs was already throwing a massive, theatrical tantrum about the presentation of the appetizers. I took the uniform without a single word of correction. Moving unnoticed has always been my specialty, and right now the uniform was the perfect vantage point to observe the rot from the inside out. I wrapped the apron around my waist, buttoned the tailored black vest over my old sweatshirt, and picked up a large silver tray filled with clean, polished crystal glassware. As I pushed through the heavy double swinging doors leading into the main ballroom foyer, the contrast was absolutely blinding. Downstairs was the sweat, heat, and machinery of real, back-breaking labor. Upstairs was a carefully constructed theater of gold trim, cascading crystal chandeliers, and hollow prestige. My brother Preston was standing at the absolute center of the dance floor, looking every bit the part of the pampered prince my parents had relentlessly trained him to be. He was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that probably cost more than 3 months of my old rent. He was laughing loudly with a group of young men who looked like they had never worked a single grueling hour in their entire lives, holding a glass of premium champagne like it was a prop in a movie about his life. My mother, Margaret, and my father, Richard, were hovering near the main entrance archway, their faces locked into rigid, triumphant smiles. They were greeting the arriving guests with an exaggerated, desperate warmth that felt entirely rehearsed. They were introducing Preston not just as their son, but as a future elite partner in a grand legacy. They looked completely intoxicated by the surrounding luxury, completely unaware that the velvet drapes they were touching and the marble floors they were standing on were owned completely by the son they had just ignored at the front gate. I moved through the edge of the crowd, offering drinks from my silver tray, watching the social dynamics unfold with a cold, highly analytical eye. It didn't take long to realize that Preston wasn't the only one playing a desperate part tonight. The bride's family, the family my parents were so frantic to impress, radiated a very specific, toxic kind of confidence. It was the kind of arrogance that comes from believing the rules of the normal world simply do not apply to you. Winston, the father of the bride, was a tall, silver-haired man who wore a tailored suit and held his expensive Scotch glass like a royal scepter. His wife, Beatrice, was inspecting the elaborate, towering floral arches near the main stage with narrowed, highly critical eyes. She was touching the delicate white roses with her manicured nails, as if she were checking for defects in a cheap product she had accidentally bought at a discount store. Their daughter, Victoria, stood perfectly still beside Preston. Her smile was objectively beautiful but entirely vacant, her eyes constantly scanning the room, calculating the net worth of every single guest in attendance. They looked like a family at the absolute peak of financial security, an empire of old money. But as I drew closer to their central circle to clear empty glasses from a side table, I caught the sharp, low whisper of a conversation that made my grip tighten on the silver tray until my knuckles turned completely white. Winston was leaning in very close to Richard. His voice dropped to a confidential, heavy murmur that carried just enough weight for me to hear over the soft jazz music playing from the live band. He was talking about a high-value real estate development project on the opposite coast, dropping massive numbers and complex investment terms with casual indifference. My father, Richard, was nodding eagerly, his eyes wide with the desperate hunger of a middle-class man who wanted nothing more than to be permanently included in a millionaire's inner circle. Richard nervously mentioned that he was prepared to liquidate his entire 401k retirement fund and tap into the residual equity of our family home to help fund Preston's entry into the family's investment portfolio. Winston smiled. It was a slow, terrifying, predatory expression that didn't reach his cold eyes. He patted Richard firmly on the shoulder and told my father that family always looks out for family. He promised that once the wedding contract was officially finalized, Preston would be positioned to inherit a significant, controlling share of their legacy holdings. It was a flawless, Oscar-worthy performance of old money generosity. But because my daily life consisted of handling corporate asset verification, auditing massive financial structures, and navigating aggressive lawsuit settlements, I noticed the small, telling details Winston was trying desperately to hide. I noticed the way his hand shook slightly when he checked his vintage watch. I noticed the subtle, frayed edge on the collar of his tailored shirt, a very minor detail that most ordinary people would miss, but to an expert, it was a glaring sign of a family trying desperately to stretch the rotting remnants of a dying wardrobe. I noticed his shoes lacked the bespoke stitching of true luxury. Winston wasn't a king making an alliance. He was a drowning man trying to tie an anchor to my father's neck. Before I could analyze the conversation any further, a sharp, incredibly arrogant voice cut through the air directly behind me. It was Tristan, Victoria's older brother, a man whose entire personality seemed built on the expensive leather shoes he was wearing and the trust fund he falsely claimed to have. He had a deep, mocking smirk on his face as he deliberately blocked my path, holding his empty glass out right in front of my chest. He looked me up and down, his gaze lingering on my faded sweatshirt showing beneath the serving vest. He entirely failed to recognize me as Preston's older brother because he had never bothered to look at the old photos Margaret kept hidden away in a dusty drawer. He asked me if I was actually working tonight or just taking up space, his voice deliberately loud enough to draw the attention of the nearby guests. I stood perfectly still, holding the heavy tray, keeping my eyes completely level with his. I didn't say a word. Tristan took my professional silence as weakness. He pulled a crumpled $20 bill from his pocket, dropped it onto my tray right among the dirty glasses, and whispered that if I wasn't too busy being utterly incompetent, I could bring a fresh bottle of premium liquor up to his private suite later. He turned back to his wealthy friends and laughed out loud, muttering about how these local service workers always get so incredibly sensitive when they actually have to do real labor for a living. I felt the insult like a physical weight pressing against my ribs, but I didn't drop the tray, and I didn't lose my temper. I simply turned away, carrying the dirty glass and the crumpled bill back toward the kitchen doors. I knew that every single piece of arrogance they displayed tonight was being meticulously written down on a cosmic ledger, and the bill was coming due much, much faster than they realized. When I pushed back through the double doors into the kitchen, the atmosphere had shifted drastically from regular high-end stress to total, unadulterated panic. Chef Remy was standing near the primary expediting counter, his face bright red, shouting aggressively at the floor manager who had rushed past me earlier. The young manager was holding a red slip of paper, his hands trembling violently as he explained that the primary corporate credit card provided by the bride's family for the event's interim payment had just been declined by the processing bank. The digital terminal was flashing an absolute notification of insufficient funds for a transaction of this massive scale. The entire resort banquet staff was frozen in place, realizing that they were currently serving a 5-star, multi-course dinner for a highly demanding family that couldn't even cover the basic catering deposit. I stood perfectly still in the shadow of the tall prep rack, listening to the truth finally break open. I thought this embarrassing financial failure was the only secret the family was hiding tonight. I was so incredibly wrong. The kitchen grew deathly quiet as Chef Remy slammed his heavy metal-tasting spoon onto the stainless steel counter. The loud clatter echoed off the white tile walls like a gunshot, cutting through the ambient noise of boiling water and sizzling meat. He aggressively demanded to know how an elite family, the kind of family currently dripping in diamonds upstairs, could possibly have a returned event payment on a busy weekend night. The young floor manager could only stammer, repeating that the bank's automated system had labeled the account as frozen due to outstanding corporate liens and an active federal lawsuit. The truth rippled through the line cooks and the servers in a chilling, palpable wave of immediate resentment. They had spent weeks enduring my future sister-in-law Victoria's ridiculous, constantly changing demands. She had rewritten the premium menu 3 separate times, forcing the kitchen to source rare ingredients at a premium cost, and the staff had been working brutal double shifts just to ensure her fantasy evening was flawless. Now, they were looking at the very real possibility of working a grueling 14-hour shift for absolutely nothing, their overtime pay evaporating into thin air. Chef Remy threatened to immediately halt the main course service and walk out. I stepped away from the prep counter, my mind working through the raw data with rapid, mathematical precision. The pieces of the puzzle that had felt disjointed and strange all evening, the security guard's overly aggressive behavior at the gate, my mother's desperate compliance, Preston's empty arrogance, and Winston's highly predatory interest in my father's 401k retirement funds, suddenly locked together like a complex mosaic of pure financial desperation. This entire engagement party wasn't a celebration of love, and it certainly wasn't a celebration of family success. It was a carefully staged, high-stakes theatrical performance designed specifically to secure a fresh injection of middle-class capital before the curtains came crashing down on their financial ghost ship. They were hunting for a bailout, and my clueless parents were willingly walking right into the slaughterhouse, eager to hand over their life savings just for a seat at a table that was already heavily mortgaged to the bank. I washed my hands at the deep commercial sink, slowly untied the linen apron, and dropped the black uniform vest onto an empty rolling cart. The kitchen staff was too busy arguing about whether to stop the main course service to notice me leave. I walked past the steaming dishwashing stations and headed straight toward the back service corridor, my boots clicking firmly against the gray concrete floor. I wasn't angry about the petty insult from Tristan anymore. That kind of anger was meant for small men. My anger had sharpened into a cold, highly clinical purpose. I reached the secure elevator bay at the far end of the hall, a private, heavily restricted wing that required a level of security clearance no one on the banquet floor even knew existed. I pressed my right thumb firmly against the small, biometric glass scanner concealed behind a bronze decorative wall plaque. The scanner read my print, blinked green with a soft, electronic chime, and the heavy, wood-paneled elevator doors slid open instantly. I stepped inside the spacious cabin and hit the single glowing button for the top floor, the executive suite where the real ownership of the resort operated. As the elevator began its silent, rapid ascent away from the noise and chaos of the ballroom, I watched my reflection in the polished mirror. I was still wearing my plain jeans and my old gray sweatshirt, the exact clothes my family thought made me an invisible, worthless failure. But up on the top floor, those clothes didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the digital signature attached to my massive corporate account. The executive floor was wrapped in a profound, expensive silence that felt a million miles away from the chaotic tension downstairs. The wide hallways were lined with deep, plush wool carpets, muted architectural lighting, and the faint, incredibly clean scent of natural wood polish and leather. There were no frantic managers up here, no arrogant rich kids tossing crumpled bills at the staff, no mothers adjusting collars to hide their shame. When the elevator doors opened, the shift in power was immediate and total. Downstairs, I was a ghost they could push out to the service entrance. Up here, I was the absolute authority, the sole individual who decided whether their entire world would continue to exist tomorrow morning. I walked down the hall toward the heavy double-glass doors of the primary owner's suite, my hand perfectly steady as I prepared to open the ultimate ledger on my family's grand illusion. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the private office. The massive space was exactly as I had left it during my morning operational review: clean architectural lines, minimalist charcoal furniture, and a massive, floor-to-ceiling glass window that offered a sweeping, panoramic view of the entire dark coastline and the glittering lights of the resort below. The ballroom windows downstairs were glowing brightly through the glass like a golden, highly expensive lie against the dark backdrop of the ocean. I walked directly over to the master control desk, woke up the multi-screen monitor wall with a touch, and initialized my private secure connection to the resort's internal security network. With a few quick taps on the encrypted glass interface, every single high-definition security camera in the entire facility answered my command. I pulled up the live feeds for the ballroom entrances, the kitchen corridors, the main valet station, and the private alcoves surrounding the central stage. I needed to see exactly how far the bride's family was willing to go to protect their rapidly collapsing reputation. I rewound the digital feed for the primary ballroom audiovisual control booth, tracking the precise timeline back to 45 minutes ago, right before the formal toast sequence was scheduled to begin. The screen flickered, then displayed a crisp, high-definition angle of the dark hallway directly behind the main stage. There he was, Winston, the sophisticated patriarch of old money, looking around nervously like a common thief in a local convenience store. He was standing very close to Sammy, one of my junior audiovisual technicians. Winston's hand slid quickly out of his tailored jacket pocket, holding a thick, heavy stack of $100 bills, and he slipped the cash directly into Sammy's palm. The young technician nodded quickly, his eyes darting upward toward the ceiling cameras, completely unaware that this specific, high-resolution feed was routed directly to my private office via an encrypted fiber line that bypasses the main security desk. Winston pointed aggressively at the main microphone stand where Preston was supposed to give his formal acceptance speech to the guests. Then Winston gestured toward a small, black hardware device he had pulled from his pocket. It was a deliberate, highly organized act of technical sabotage. Winston was paying my employee to intentionally cut the master audio feed during Preston's introduction, creating an artificial technical failure that would force the event to be delayed. He wanted to cause chaos so my father wouldn't have the opportunity to publicly question the financial logistics of the wedding contract before the binding legal documents were signed the next morning. I watched the video play out twice, my breathing slowing down as a cold, incredibly dangerous clarity took over my entire mind. I switched the secondary monitor to my personal corporate database, bringing up the real-time financial asset verification reports that Elena, my chief legal assistant, had compiled earlier in the afternoon. I opened the master file securely labeled with Winston's corporate registration name. The data cascading across the screen was an absolute horror show of hidden liability and aggressive litigation. Page after page of unpaid commercial mortgages, stacking federal tax liens, immediate bank foreclosures, and urgent warning letters from federal credit compliance boards. There were even records of a messy, impending divorce filing meant to shield remaining assets, and brutal custody battles over trust funds that didn't actually exist anymore. The great legacy estate they claimed to own on the opposite coast wasn't an asset. It was a hollow shell holding on by a single thread of borrowed time, exactly one formal court notice away from leaving their possession entirely. They were completely, fundamentally bankrupt, and they were using my younger brother as an absolute financial reset button to drag my father's life savings into their inescapable black hole of debt. I leaned back heavily in my leather executive chair, staring at the glowing screens, the glow reflecting in my eyes. I thought this massive corporate fraud was the deepest level of betrayal I would find tonight. I was so incredibly wrong. I leaned forward, my fingers flying across the dark glass surface of the control console as I initiated a direct, highly secure line to the resort's ground floor security department. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any raw anger, panic, or hesitation. It carried only the cold, absolute authority of a man who controlled the payroll and the legal destiny of everyone in the building. I instructed the chief of security to immediately isolate the audio booth camera footage, lock down the digital timestamps to prevent any tampering, and prepare a formal legal incident report regarding the illegal corporate bribery of an active staff member. I told him to contact the local authorities and hold them on standby at the main gate, keeping their lights off so as not to spook the targets. But I gave him strict orders to take absolutely no public action until I personally provided the clearance signal from the ballroom floor. This wasn't just a matter of kicking out a bad guest. This was a matter of securing irrefutable evidence for a massive fraud lawsuit. Next, I dialed the internal extension for Victor, the general manager of the resort. Victor answered on the first ring, his tone instantly professional, though I could easily hear the underlying stress of the chaotic situation downstairs leaking through the phone line. He immediately began to apologize for the returned banquet invoice, stating that he was currently preparing to quietly approach Winston in a private room to settle the outstanding balance without causing a massive scene in front of the high-profile guests. He wanted to protect the resort's reputation. I cut him short, using the precise, quiet tone that let him know this wasn't a standard operational issue and that standard hospitality protocols were officially suspended. I told Victor to take the master red folder containing the official bank rejection notice, the itemized event invoice, and the complete, damning corporate lien report for Winston's estate. I instructed him to bring those documents directly out onto the main ballroom floor in exactly 10 minutes. I gave him a very specific directive. He was to ignore Winston entirely, he was to walk right past my parents as if they didn't exist, and he was to deliver the folder directly to me. Furthermore, he was to address me by my full corporate title in front of every single individual in attendance. Victor paused for a fraction of a second, the immense gravity of my command fully registering in his experienced mind, before responding with a quiet, highly respectful confirmation. He knew a storm was coming, and he knew exactly who was bringing it. Everything was going to be handled legally, cleanly, and with absolute corporate precision. This wasn't going to be a petty, emotional outburst of revenge for the humiliation I had experienced at the front gate. This wasn't about Tristan dropping a $20 bill on my tray, and it wasn't about Margaret rolling up her window to ignore her eldest son. Those were minor insults from small, irrelevant people. This was going to be a massive systemic correction, a grand presentation of cold, undeniable truth replacing an expensive, highly destructive performance. I stood up from my desk, walked over to the floor-to-ceiling glass window, and looked down at the courtyard far below. The ballroom lights were glowing warmly through the glass like a brilliant, beautiful lie. It was a golden cage that my family had willingly entered because they were too busy looking at the shiny polish to check the structural integrity of the bars. They still thought I was down in the sweltering kitchen peeling shrimp. They still thought I didn't belong in their picture-perfect country club life. They had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath their feet had already fundamentally shifted, and they were about to learn that devastating lesson the hard way. I walked over to the executive wardrobe situated near the office door. For a brief second, I considered changing into one of the custom-tailored linen suits I kept there for high-level corporate board meetings and real estate closings. But as my hand brushed the expensive fabric, I stopped. No, the plain, faded jeans and the old gray sweatshirt were the exact clothes they had used to judge my entire worth as a human being. It was only fitting that they should see those exact same clothes when their entire illusion fell apart in front of their eyes. I turned away from the wardrobe, stepped back into the private elevator, and hit the button for the ballroom level. As the elevator descended rapidly through the core of the building, I pulled out my personal phone and synced it directly to the resort's master AV control network, completely overriding the local settings Sammy had tried to sabotage. I uploaded the digital video clips of the bribery, the high-definition screenshots of the bank foreclosures, and the official public records of the liens directly into the primary media queue for the ballroom's massive integrated LED projector screens. I kept my thumb hovered carefully over the activation button, my heartbeat steady and slow, the exact way it always does when a complex negotiation reaches its final, critical phase. The elevator doors slid open with a soft hiss, and the immediate blast of heat, loud live music, and overlapping voices hit me like a physical wall. I stepped back out into the ballroom foyer, picking up an empty silver serving tray from a side table just to maintain the absolute disguise for a few moments longer. The crowd was at its absolute peak capacity now, the guests holding their champagne glasses like tiny trophies of social validation, their laughter sounding forced and entirely rehearsed for the benefit of the surrounding elite. No one noticed me as I moved silently along the perimeter of the room. To them, I was still completely invisible, a shadow wrapped in the uniform of a world they believed existed solely to serve their comfort. I looked across the massive room and saw Preston standing near the grand floral arrangement, his arm wrapped tightly around Victoria's waist, both of them looking completely untouchable, smiling for the cameras. I thought this moment of peak arrogance was the highest point of their delusion, the calm right before I triggered the storm. I was so incredibly wrong. I stood perfectly still in the deepest, darkest shadows of the grand ballroom's perimeter, holding that polished silver serving tray against my chest like a medieval shield. From my concealed vantage point near the towering, incredibly expensive floral arrangements I had personally approved the purchase orders for weeks ago, I had an absolutely unobstructed view of the central stage. The live jazz band, a highly sought-after quintet I had flown in specifically for the resort's premium entertainment roster, had smoothly transitioned into a soft, ambient melody. It was a clear, universally understood signal in high society gatherings that the formal speeches were about to begin. The guests, completely unaware of the absolute financial disaster hovering right above their heads like a guillotine, began to gravitate slowly toward the center of the room. They clinked their premium champagne glasses, laughing at inside jokes, fully and willingly bought into the grand, glittering illusion that Winston and Beatrice had so meticulously constructed. Every single detail of this room was an insult to the honest, back-breaking labor happening downstairs in the kitchen. The cascading crystal chandeliers overhead cast a warm, golden, almost ethereal glow over people who had spent their entire adult lives treating others like disposable stepping stones. I watched the servers, men and women whose salaries I paid, people who actually worked for a living and worried about their rent, move carefully through the dense crowd. They offered incredibly expensive hors d'oeuvres on silver platters to guests who wouldn't even look them in the eye, treating them as if they were invisible pieces of machinery. It was sickening to watch. I watched my mother, Margaret, practically vibrating with a toxic, desperate excitement. She was standing shoulder to shoulder with Beatrice near the front row of tables, trying desperately to mirror the older woman's posture, her facial expressions, and even the specific way she held her champagne flute. Margaret looked exactly like a lottery winner who hadn't yet realized the winning ticket clutched tightly in her hand was a complete, worthless forgery. She was so desperate to belong, so hungry for the validation of these wealthy strangers, that she was willing to completely erase her own identity. Beside her, my father, Richard, was locked in an intense, animated conversation with Winston. I could see Richard nodding enthusiastically, his posture overly eager, his shoulders hunched slightly in a subconscious display of submission. He was completely blinded by the dazzling prospect of entering high society. I knew exactly what was going through his mind. He was ready to sign away his hard-earned pension, his entire salary history, and the remaining equity of his suburban home just for the fleeting privilege of being publicly associated with Winston's fraudulent legacy. Then Preston stepped up to the microphone. My younger brother looked incredibly handsome in his custom-tailored tuxedo, his hair styled to absolute, meticulous perfection. He tapped the microphone with his index finger, a sharp, clear, percussive sound that echoed beautifully across the massive, acoustically optimized ballroom. The crowd immediately fell silent, their collective attention locked completely onto the golden child. Preston smiled. It was that exact same lazy, infuriatingly arrogant smile he had used at our Thanksgiving dinners when he openly mocked my career choices and my faded flannel shirts. He gripped the edges of the podium and began to speak. He spoke about love, of course, but it sounded like he was reading from a generic corporate greeting card. He spoke about finding his absolute perfect match in Victoria, and about the beautiful, seamless blending of two incredible, legacy-driven families. It was a perfectly rehearsed, entirely sterile speech, hollow and completely devoid of any real emotional depth or vulnerability. He spoke of heritage and long-term legacy as if he actually understood the grueling, terrifying cost of building a business from the ground up. He thanked his parents for always supporting his dreams and fostering his ambition, a public statement that felt like a deliberate, twisted knife to my gut. I was the son they had quietly buried in the background of their lives, the son whose college fund had been violently reappropriated to cover Preston's legal fees and fraternity dues. To hear him stand on my stage and praise their parenting was a masterclass in psychological agony. While Preston continued his empty monologue, my eyes tracked Winston. The sophisticated patriarch of this bankrupt family was standing near the edge of the stage, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his tailored trousers to project an aura of total relaxation. But his eyes told a completely different story. They were darting nervously, obsessively, toward the back of the room, specifically targeting the dark, soundproof glass window of the audiovisual control booth. I knew exactly what he was waiting for. He was waiting for Sammy, my newly compromised AV technician, to pull the plug. He was waiting for the manufactured technical failure that would throw the room into sudden chaos, delay the rest of the scheduled speeches, and give Winston the perfect, chaotic excuse to pull Richard into a private side room and finalize the transfer of the retirement funds before the morning banks opened their doors. Winston pulled his right hand out of his pocket, smoothed his tie, and gave a subtle, sharp, downward nod toward the AV booth. That was the signal. The trap was springing. I watched Sammy through the glass. The young technician reached forward, his hand visibly trembling under the weight of the massive bribe he had just pocketed, and slammed his index finger down on the master kill switch for the analog audio board. Absolutely nothing happened. Preston's voice continued to echo crystal clear through the state-of-the-art surround sound speakers, filling the room without a single pop of static. I had already used my executive administrative override from the top floor to lock the digital soundboard directly from my secure internal network. The physical buttons on Sammy's desk were entirely dead. Sammy frantically hit the button again. He hit it 3 times in rapid succession. I could see the sheer panic completely washing over his face. He started violently pulling physical XLR cables out of the local analog board, desperate to sever the connection, but the audio feed remained perfectly, stubbornly stable because the signal was routing digitally through the ceiling arrays. Down on the floor, Winston's confident, aristocratic facade began to aggressively crack. His jaw tightened until the muscles bulged. He stared at the AV booth, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound confusion and rising, uncontrollable anger. He didn't understand why his incredibly expensive bribe wasn't working. He didn't understand the fundamental rule of modern infrastructure. You cannot hijack a system when the actual owner of the building is holding the master digital keys in his pocket. Preston finally finished his agonizing speech to a round of polite, wealthy applause. He raised his glass in a toast, leaned over to kiss Victoria on the cheek, and stepped back from the podium. Now it was Winston's turn. The older man forced a completely fake, incredibly strained smile onto his face, adjusting his suit jacket as he walked up to the microphone. He gripped the metal stand so tightly that his knuckles turned a stark, bone white. He started delivering a speech about the critical importance of securing a strong financial future, about the deep, unbreakable bonds of family business, and about how he viewed Preston not just as a son-in-law, but as a vital new executive partner in their vast nationwide real estate empire. It was utterly nauseating to listen to. The absolute audacity of the man was staggering. He was standing on my stage, using my expensive electricity, speaking into my high-end microphone, actively trying to steal my father's life savings to pay off a mountain of toxic, radioactive debt. As Winston droned on and on about corporate synergy and elite legacy investments, I saw Tristan leaning casually against the main mahogany bar. Tristan, the arrogant brother who had thrown a crumpled $20 bill on my tray, was laughing out loud with his friends, completely oblivious to his father's internal panic. They were all so incredibly comfortable in their false superiority. They truly, deeply believed they had engineered the perfect financial scam. I checked my watch. The luminescent hands indicated that exactly 10 minutes had passed since my phone call to the executive office. The timing had to be absolutely flawless. I wanted their collective illusion to reach its absolute zenith before I brought the heavy hammer of reality crashing down. I wanted Winston to feel completely secure, to feel the heavy weight of my father's life savings almost within his greedy grasp, before the floor vanished entirely beneath him. I watched him gesture grandly toward my parents. I watched Margaret wipe a fake, theatrical tear from her eye as Winston spoke about the beautiful, historic alliance between their families. The sheer hypocrisy saturating the room was thick enough to physically choke on. These people had spent their entire lives using vanity as a weapon, judging everyone by the cost of their clothes, the brand of their cars, and the zip code of their real estate. They truly believed that because I was standing in a dark corner wearing a faded sweatshirt, I was powerless. They didn't understand that real power doesn't need a custom tuxedo. Real power is quiet, legally bulletproof, and completely unyielding. Right on cue, the massive, heavy oak doors at the main entrance of the ballroom swung open. The sheer weight and velocity of the doors opening caused a slight, noticeable shift in the air pressure of the room, drawing the immediate attention of several guests standing near the back. Victor, the general manager of the resort, stepped through the grand archway. He was a tall, incredibly imposing man who carried himself with the absolute rigid precision of a seasoned military officer. He was wearing his immaculate charcoal gray director's suit, and in his right hand, pressed firmly against his side, he held a thick, bright red corporate folder. In our specific hospitality network, the color red means one thing and one thing only: catastrophic operational failure. Winston paused mid-sentence, the words catching in his throat as his eyes locked onto Victor. A flicker of genuine, unadulterated fear passed over the older man's face. He recognized the general manager, and he knew from decades of attending high-end events that an executive of Victor's senior level did not interrupt a private VIP gathering unless something had gone terribly, unrecoverably wrong. Winston quickly tried to wrap up his speech, his words suddenly stumbling over each other in a rushed, panicked cadence, but it was far too late. Victor began his march across the ballroom floor. He didn't politely walk around the edge of the crowd. He walked directly through the absolute center, his presence commanding so much intense authority that the wealthy guests naturally, instinctively parted to let him through. Margaret, my mother, saw Victor approaching. Ever the desperate social climber, she assumed the general manager was coming to offer a special complimentary gift, perhaps an elite wine, to the parents of the groom. She stepped forward enthusiastically, smoothing down the fabric of her expensive dress, and plastered on her most radiant, aggressively fake smile. She actually reached her hand out toward Victor, fully ready to receive the praise and the spotlight. Victor didn't even look at her. He didn't slow his stride by a single fraction of a second. He walked right past my mother as if she were a piece of invisible, irrelevant furniture. Margaret's smile froze instantly, her outstretched hand hovering awkwardly in the empty air. A low, confused murmur began to ripple rapidly through the crowd as people noticed the blatant, shocking social slight. Victor kept walking. He bypassed Richard entirely. He completely ignored Winston, who was now gripping the microphone stand in silent terror on the stage. He ignored Preston and Victoria. He walked straight toward the dark, quiet corner of the room where the extra catering supplies were kept. He walked straight toward the man in the faded denim jeans, the old gray sweatshirt, and the black serving apron. He walked straight toward me. The entire ballroom fell into a stunned, incredibly heavy silence. The jazz band stopped playing abruptly, the final note hanging awkwardly in the air. The only sound in the massive, cavernous room was the firm, rhythmic, intimidating click of Victor's polished leather shoes on the marble floor. He stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me. He snapped his heels together, stood at absolute perfect attention, and bowed his head slightly in a gesture of profound, undeniable professional respect. "Mr. Lane," Victor said. His voice was deep, highly resonant, and deliberately loud enough to carry to the furthest corners of the room without needing a microphone. "I sincerely apologize for the interruption, sir, but we have a critical legal and financial emergency regarding this specific event, and I require your direct, executive authorization to proceed." I slowly lowered the silver serving tray, placing it deliberately and heavily onto the nearby wooden table. The sound of the thick crystal glasses hitting the wood was deafening in the totally silent room. I reached behind my back, untied the black linen apron, and let it drop to the floor. I stood up straight, looking right past Victor, locking my eyes directly onto my mother. Margaret's face had drained of all color, leaving her looking completely spectral. Her mouth was slightly open, her eyes darting frantically between my casual clothes and the highly respected general manager. Her brain completely, fundamentally unable to process the data it was receiving. "Report the situation, Victor," I said. My voice was calm, entirely flat, and completely devoid of the fear, the subservience, and the anxiety they had always expected from me. "The interim corporate payment provided by the bride's family has been decisively rejected by the Federal Processing Bank," Victor announced, projecting his voice to the entire room so there could be no misunderstandings. "Furthermore, our corporate legal department has explicitly confirmed that the accounts in question are currently entirely frozen due to multiple active federal tax liens and an impending, massive corporate foreclosure. We are currently hosting a completely unfunded event. How would you like me to handle the immediate eviction of these specific individuals from your property, sir?" The silence that followed was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating, terrifying silence of a bomb dropping right in the middle of a crowded room, hanging suspended in the air just a microsecond before the shockwave obliterates everything. I had walked into this party through the dirty service entrance. Now, I was the only man in the room holding the keys to the entire kingdom. "My property?" Margaret whispered. The words barely escaped her trembling lips, but in the absolute, dead silence of the ballroom, they carried like a physical shout. She took a staggering step forward, her hands shaking uncontrollably, her wide eyes entirely focused on my plain, gray sweatshirt. "Julian, what on earth is he talking about? You're a waiter. You work in gig economies. You live in a terrible apartment. What does he mean, your property?" I didn't answer her directly. I didn't need to waste my breath on explanations when I had irrefutable proof. I reached slowly into the pocket of my jeans, pulled out my smartphone, and tapped the master activation button I had queued up while standing in the executive suite. Instantly, the ambient, warm lighting in the ballroom dimmed to pitch black. The massive 20-foot high-definition LED screens flanking the main stage, the very screens that had been displaying a looping, highly romanticized, incredibly expensive photo slideshow of Preston and Victoria, flickered violently. The romantic classical music cut out entirely, replaced by the low, electronic hum of the massive projectors kicking into high gear. When the screens illuminated again, the brilliant, unforgiving white light cast long, harsh shadows across the faces of the terrified guests. The first image projected onto the massive screens was the crystal-clear, high-definition security footage from the dark hallway immediately behind the stage. The video started playing on an endless, inescapable, damning loop. There was Winston, the incredibly wealthy patriarch, the man who was just lecturing the room about the sanctity of legacy and honor. He was caught on ultra-clear video pulling a massive, undeniable stack of cash from his tailored suit jacket and aggressively shoving it into the hands of my junior AV technician. The audio of the video was piped directly through the main speakers. Every single person in the room heard Winston clearly and explicitly instruct Sammy to cut the microphone to create a distraction. "This is an absolute outrage," Winston roared, his face turning a violent, blotchy shade of purple as the panic finally shattered his aristocratic composure. He pointed a shaking, accusatory finger directly at my face. "This is a completely illegal recording. This is a gross invasion of privacy. I will bury you under a mountain of litigation. I will have my personal lawyer strip you of everything you own. You will be working in a kitchen for the rest of your miserable life." "Your lawyer?" I asked, my voice carrying effortlessly through the room, cutting through his hysteria like a scalpel. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, leaving the shadows of the catering corner. I walked straight into the absolute center of the ballroom, placing myself squarely between my utterly confused family and the stage where Winston stood. "Your lawyer, Arthur Vance, officially dropped you as a client last Tuesday at 4 p.m. due to 3 consecutive months of unpaid legal retainer fees. But we can certainly talk about lawsuits if you really want to go down that road, Winston." I tapped my phone screen again. The video of the bribery shrunk to the top left corner of the LED displays, continuing to loop, making room for a series of highly detailed, legally verified corporate documents. The words "public record" flashed across the top of the screens in bold, unmistakable red letters. "Let's talk about your legacy," I said, projecting my voice so every single wealthy guest, every potential investor, and every socialite in the room could hear the absolute, unvarnished truth. I pointed directly at the glowing screens. "Here is the official bank foreclosure notice for your massive, historic estate on the opposite coast. It was served exactly 48 hours ago by a federal marshal. Here are the multiple active federal tax liens placed on your primary corporate holding company. Here are the financial records showing your completely drained college fund accounts. And here, in the bottom right corner, are the sealed legal documents for a remarkably messy divorce filing that your wife, Beatrice, initiated exactly 6 months ago, attempting to shield whatever meager assets you have left from the highly aggressive bankruptcy court." A collective, massive gasp ripped through the audience. The sound of 100 people simultaneously realizing they were sharing air with a fraud. Beatrice, the arrogant mother who had been inspecting my floral arrangements like a judgmental queen just an hour ago, let out a sharp, pathetic cry and covered her face with her trembling hands. Tristan, the older brother who had tossed a $20 bill on my tray and demanded I serve him, physically stepped backward. He bumped into a cocktail table, sending glasses crashing to the floor. His face was completely pale, drained of all his fake bravado, as his wealthy friends suddenly stepped away from him as if he were carrying a highly contagious, terminal disease. "You are absolutely, fundamentally bankrupt," I stated, my eyes locked onto Winston, completely ignoring his sputtering attempts to speak. "You don't have a legacy. You don't have a trust fund. You don't even own the suit you are wearing. You are drowning in toxic, inescapable debt. And your brilliant, final exit strategy was to use this engagement party as a desperate smokescreen. You planned to use my younger brother to manipulate my father into liquidating his entire 401k retirement fund. You were going to steal my parents' home equity to temporarily pay off your immediate creditors, leaving them entirely destitute, homeless, and broken in their old age." I turned my head slightly, looking directly at my father. Richard was shaking violently, his knuckles white as his hands gripped the back of a nearby chair just to keep himself standing. The brutal truth was hitting him like a runaway freight train. He had been mere minutes away from signing away his entire life, the culmination of 40 years of work, to a man who was actively, maliciously trying to destroy him. "Julian," Preston stammered, stepping down heavily from the stage. My golden brother looked completely, utterly broken. The arrogant, untouchable confidence he had worn his entire life had completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrified child wearing an expensive tuxedo. He looked up at the massive screens, seeing the undeniable proof of his fiancée's financial ruin, then looked at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying, world-shattering realization. "Julian, how did you get this? How do you know all of this? You're just Julian." "Yes, I am just Julian," I said, my voice dropping to a lower, much more dangerous, resonant register. "The brother you mocked at Thanksgiving for wearing a flannel shirt. The son you banished to the service entrance tonight alongside the garbage because my clothes didn't match your fake, carefully curated aesthetic. But while you were busy spending money you didn't have to impress people who don't actually care about you, I was building reality." I gestured to Victor, who was still standing at perfect attention nearby, completely unfazed by the drama unfolding around him. "Victor, please clarify the exact ownership structure of this commercial property for the guests." "Gladly, sir," Victor replied, his voice booming with absolute, undeniable authority. "This entire luxury resort, the hundreds of acres of surrounding coastal land, and the entire Lane Holdings hospitality network spanning across 3 states are wholly and privately owned by the man standing before you, Mr. Julian Lane. He is the sole majority shareholder, the founder, and the absolute chief executive. Everyone in this room is currently standing on his private property." The silence returned, but this time it was suffocating, heavy with the weight of massive consequences. Margaret slumped heavily against Richard, her legs physically giving out beneath her as she let out a low wail. She stared at me, her mind desperately trying to reconcile the image of the vagrant, disappointing son she had completely abandoned with the billionaire titan currently standing in the center of the room commanding an empire. The son she had denied a portion of his own grandfather's family inheritance. The son whose college fund she had brazenly stolen to pay for Preston's reckless driving mistakes and fraternity dues. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far, you're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. Now, back to the absolute chaos in the ballroom. Winston wasn't completely done fighting. Like a cornered, desperate rat, he lashed out with whatever weapons he thought he had left. He lunged off the stage, pointing a shaking finger aggressively at my face, trying to close the physical distance between us to intimidate me. You think you're so damn smart? Winston spat, his breath smelling heavily of stale scotch and sheer, unadulterated panic. You think you can just humiliate us in public and walk away clean? I have powerful friends. I have deep political connections. I will sue this resort into the absolute ground for public defamation and emotional distress. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I didn't even raise my voice. I looked at him with absolute, freezing, terrifying contempt. Defamation requires the presentation of false statements. Winston. Everything projected on those screens is verified public record, legally obtained credit reports, and my own internal security footage. You have absolutely no legal standing in any court in this country. But I do. I took a deliberate step closer to him, forcing him to physically crane his neck to look up at me. You attempted to execute a massive, coordinated financial fraud on my property. You actively bribed my employee to sabotage my expensive technical equipment. You attempted to extort a vulnerable man for his retirement savings. You are currently trespassing on private commercial real estate with a returned, fraudulent corporate check. I raised my right hand high in the air and signaled the back of the room. The heavy oak doors swung open again. 6 fully uniformed resort security officers, led by Brutus, the exact same guard who had sent me to the service entrance hours earlier, marched aggressively into the ballroom. Brutus looked at me, then looked at the floor, absolute terror in his eyes, finally realizing exactly who he had insulted at the gate. I am giving you exactly one single option, I told Winston, my voice echoing through the silent room like a federal judge handing down a final, unappealable sentence. You, your complicit wife, your fake millionaire son, and your manipulating daughter will turn around right now. You will walk out of those back service doors, the exact same dirty loading dock doors you made me walk through. You will get off my property within 5 minutes. If you are not completely off the resort grounds by the time my watch hits the quarter hour, I will authorize Victor to hand this entire red folder of evidence over to the federal authorities currently waiting at the front gate, and I will personally fund the aggressive lawsuit that puts you in a federal penitentiary for the rest of your natural life. Winston's jaw trembled violently. The last remaining shreds of his carefully cultivated aristocratic persona completely dissolved. He looked around the massive ballroom, his eyes darting frantically from table to table, desperately searching for a single friendly face, a single wealthy ally who would step in to defend his honor or offer him a lifeline. But the high society guests he had spent weeks aggressively courting were completely, totally silent. They were looking at him with absolute, unmasked disgust. I watched as several prominent local business owners physically stepped away from his family, creating a wide circle of isolation around them, as if proximity alone to Winston's failure would ruin their own credit scores. In the brutal, unforgiving world of high society, there is no sin greater than being poor and getting caught aggressively lying about it. Beatrice grabbed Winston's arm. Her perfectly manicured fingernails were digging so deeply into his ruined, tailored suit that I could see the fabric pulling. She was crying hysterically now, her expensive mascara running down her face in dark, ugly, pathetic streaks. Winston, let's go. Please, stop talking. Let's just go before he calls the police. Tristan didn't even wait for his parents. The arrogant, incredibly loud coward who had demanded I bring him premium liquor and mocked my clothes turned entirely on his heel. He fast-walked toward the service exit, his head firmly down, staring at the floor, completely abandoning his tough guy persona. He didn't look at his sister. He didn't look at his parents. It was every rat for themselves on the sinking ship. Winston glared at me, a look of pure, unadulterated, venomous hatred, but he knew he was completely, structurally beaten. He had brought a plastic knife to a drone strike. He aggressively grabbed Beatrice's hand and practically dragged her off the floor, stumbling awkwardly in his expensive shoes toward the back corridors of the kitchen. Victoria, the beautiful, incredibly calculating bride-to-be, was the last one left of their clan. She stood absolutely frozen next to Preston. She looked up at the massive LED screens displaying her family's total financial ruin, looked at the retreating backs of her humiliated family, and then looked slowly at my brother. For a brief, terrifying second, I saw the absolute sociopathic coldness in her eyes. The loving, devoted mask completely dropped, revealing the apex predator underneath. She wasn't looking at a man she loved. She was looking at a broken ATM machine that had just swallowed her card. Without saying a single word of comfort to Preston, without a single tear or apology, she picked up the heavy, layered skirt of her incredibly expensive designer wedding dress. She turned entirely away from the man she was supposed to marry, the man who had worshipped her, and jogged quickly after her parents, disappearing into the dark, utilitarian service hallway. The heavy ballroom doors clicked shut behind them. The immediate, malicious threat was gone. But the real, emotional wreckage remained standing right in front of me. Preston collapsed. His knees physically gave out, unable to support his weight, and he hit the hard marble floor of the ballroom. His hands gripped his perfectly styled hair, ruining it instantly. He let out a raw, agonizing, deeply guttural sob that echoed painfully through the silent room. His entire life, his entire carefully constructed identity as the golden child, the superior brother, the chosen one. It was all a complete, incredibly fragile illusion that had just shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He had absolutely nothing. No grand inheritance, no wealthy bride, no respect from his peers, and no future in the elite circles he so desperately craved. Margaret and Richard rushed forward, falling to their knees directly onto the hard floor beside their youngest son. Margaret was crying uncontrollably, a high-pitched, desperate wail. She tried to wrap her arms tightly around Preston, trying to comfort him the way she did when he failed high school algebra, but he physically shoved her away. He pushed her hard. He was realizing, perhaps for the very first time in his 26 years of sheltered life, that his parents' obsessive, toxic need for social status had directly, intentionally led him right into the jaws of a financial predator. Richard slowly looked up at me from his position on the floor. The incredibly arrogant, boastful father who had openly laughed at my cheap flannel shirt at Thanksgiving, the man who had toasted to my failure, was now a broken, terrified old man kneeling on the floor of my hotel. "Julian," Richard choked out, thick tears streaming down his wrinkled face. "Julian, my God, I didn't know. I swear to you on my life, I didn't know they were bankrupt. I was going to sign the 401k transfer papers tomorrow morning at 9. We would have lost everything. We would have been out on the street. We would have had nothing. You saved us." "I didn't do it to save you," I replied, my voice completely stripped of any warmth, familial affection, or forgiveness. The brutal honesty was entirely necessary. I did it because I absolutely refused to let parasites use my bloodline to settle their debts. I did it because my corporate security network flagged a massive fraud occurring on my commercial property, and I protect my assets. Margaret scrambled awkwardly to her feet, wiping her ruined makeup with the back of her trembling hand. She took a hesitant step toward me, reaching out her hands in a desperate, deeply pathetic pleading gesture. "Julian, honey, please. We are so incredibly sorry. We were so blind. We treated you so poorly, we didn't understand you, and you've become this incredible, massive success. You're a billionaire. You own all of this. Please let us make it right. We're family. Blood is thicker than water. We can start over. You can finally come home." I looked at the woman who had birthed me, the woman who had watched a security guard treat me like absolute garbage at the front gate and simply rolled up her tinted window to laugh with strangers. I searched my heart for a shred of empathy, a shred of son-to-mother connection. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a profound, impenetrable, incredibly peaceful emptiness. "Home?" I asked quietly, letting the word hang in the air. "I haven't had a home with you for a very, very long time, Margaret. Family doesn't steal an inheritance college fund to cover a golden child's reckless driving accident. Family doesn't banish their eldest son to the loading dock because his clothes don't feature a designer label. You don't want your son back. You just want close proximity to the owner of Lane Holdings so you can brag at your HOA meetings." I signaled Victor one last time. "Victor, escort my parents and my brother to their vehicle. Cancel the rest of the premium catering service immediately. Compensate the entire kitchen staff with a triple overtime bonus directly from my personal account for dealing with this absolute nightmare. And politely ask the remaining guests to leave the premises immediately." I didn't wait for Victor's response. I didn't want to hear another empty, meaningless apology from people who only respected my bank account. I turned my back on my parents, turned my back on my violently sobbing brother, and walked with absolute purpose toward the private executive elevator. I left them kneeling in the devastating ruins of their own superficial ambitions. The long-standing debt was settled. The emotional ledger was permanently closed. I stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the top floor, and finally exhaled a massive breath I felt like I had been holding for my entire adult life. The fallout from that catastrophic night was absolute, public, and completely irreversible. The ruined engagement party immediately became the greatest, most talked-about scandal in the local high society circles for months. Winston, Beatrice, Tristan, and Victoria completely vanished from the state within 48 hours, fleeing the crushing weight of their federal tax lawsuits, the aggressive media scrutiny, and the impending bank foreclosures. The grand, glittering illusion of their old money legacy was burned entirely to ash, replaced by the cold, incredibly hard reality of bankruptcy court, asset seizure, and legal ruin. But the most profound, lasting changes happened much closer to home. Exactly 6 months after the disastrous party, I was sitting in my executive office on the top floor, quietly reviewing a massive new commercial real estate acquisition file, when my private intercom buzzed. Elena, my highly efficient chief assistant, informed me that a young woman was vehemently, aggressively demanding a few minutes of my time in the lobby. She wouldn't leave. Against my better judgment, but driven by a cold curiosity, I allowed her to be escorted up. The heavy glass doors opened, and Victoria walked in. The former bride-to-be looked entirely different than she had at the party. The arrogant, vacant confidence was completely gone, replaced by a desperate, highly calculated, incredibly dangerous vulnerability. She was wearing a perfectly fitted designer dress, clearly trying to leverage her physical appearance to gain an advantage. She sat down smoothly across from my mahogany desk, crossed her long legs, and began to cry. A perfect, practiced, entirely tearless crying routine. She told me that she had been completely brainwashed and manipulated by her parents. She claimed she never actually loved Preston, calling him a naive, weak, incredibly pathetic little boy who was overly obsessed with his mother's approval. She leaned forward, placing her hand gently on the edge of my desk, and lowered her voice to a sultry whisper. She told me that she had always respected self-made, incredibly powerful men like me. She subtly implied that with her remaining social connections and my massive corporate wealth, we could build an unstoppable empire together. She was actively trying to execute the ultimate parasitic pivot, transferring her attachment from the broken, penniless brother directly to the billionaire owner. I didn't interrupt her. I sat back in my leather chair and let her speak for exactly 5 uninterrupted minutes. When she was finally finished, smiling at me with that predatory, incredibly hopeful look, I reached slowly across my desk and tapped the small, black recording device sitting right next to my pen holder. "Victoria, I said, my voice as cold and unforgiving as the ocean outside my window. In the state we are currently sitting in, commercial business offices hold single-party consent recording laws. I am going to email this high-definition audio file directly to my brother in exactly 2 minutes. I am not doing it to hurt him, but to finally kill the last remaining shred of illusion he holds about who you truly are. If you ever approach me, my company, my staff, or my family again, I will release the financial documents I have proving you actively helped your father hide offshore assets during a federal bankruptcy investigation. The security guards will escort you out now. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a ghost. She stood up abruptly, her seductive mask completely shattered, and practically ran out of the office. I sent the audio file to Preston that exact afternoon. It was an incredibly brutal thing to do, but sometimes you have to break a bone entirely to set it properly so it can heal. That recording was the final, devastating catalyst my brother needed. It completely destroyed the toxic vanity and the fragile ego my parents had instilled in him since birth. A few weeks later, Preston officially withdrew from the elite social clubs he couldn't afford. He cut up the high-limit credit cards my parents had been desperately trying to pay off. For the very first time in his life, he didn't ask Richard for a bailout. Instead, he walked into a small, mid-tier, incredibly average hotel on the outskirts of the city, a property I explicitly did not own or control, and applied for a job. He didn't apply for management. He applied for the maintenance and groundskeeping crew. He wanted to learn what it actually meant to earn $1 with his own calloused hands, fixing broken pipes and mowing lawns. My parents, Richard and Margaret, were forced to radically downsize their entire existence. Without the crushing, constant pressure of trying to impress Winston's fake circle, they sold the massive suburban house they couldn't afford and moved into a modest, entirely unremarkable 2-bedroom condo. They sent me letters. They left long, tearful voicemails on my corporate line. They begged for a chance to sit down and have a simple family dinner. I read the letters, I listened to the voicemails, but I never replied. Forgiveness is a beautiful, noble concept, but establishing firm, impenetrable boundaries is a matter of absolute emotional survival. I forgave them for the past, releasing the anger, but I completely refused to give them access to my future. I chose peace over the chaotic, destructive obligation of a toxic bloodline. I had to protect the massive empire I built, and more importantly, I had to protect the quiet, hard-won sanctuary I had found within my own mind. A full year and a half later, I found myself standing in the back row of a small, sunlit community garden. There were no crystal chandeliers. There were no white Lamborghinis at the valet. There were no federal lawsuits looming over the altar. Preston was standing at the front of the garden, wearing a simple, rented gray suit that didn't quite fit perfectly, but his smile was entirely genuine, reaching all the way to his eyes. He was holding the hands of a woman named Sarah, a public kindergarten teacher he had met while working his blue-collar maintenance job. She knew exactly who he was. She knew exactly how far he had fallen from grace, and she loved him anyway. It was a profoundly small, incredibly quiet, deeply honest wedding. When the brief ceremony ended, Preston walked down the small dirt aisle with his new wife. He stopped when he saw me standing in the back near the wooden exit gate. He didn't ask me for money. He didn't ask for a promotion or a job at my corporate office. He just looked at me, his eyes shining with real, hard-earned tears, and mouthed the words, "Thank you." I gave him a single respectful nod, turned around, and walked back to my truck. I didn't stay for the reception. My role in their lives was officially over. I had torn down the rotting, diseased foundation of our family, and in doing so, I had forced them to finally build something real. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to draw a massive, unforgiving line in the sand to protect your own peace, your own salary, and your own sanity from the people who were supposed to love you the most? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and I know how incredibly hard it is to break the cycle of family toxicity and protect your own mental health. Remember, you do not owe your success, your inheritance, or your promotion to the people who ignored you when you were struggling. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next journey. Until next time, stay strong and protect your peace.